Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Pei Daled. We started our chapter with a discussion about two sacrifices. The Korban HaOmer, which I should have really pointed out, we bring on the 16th of Nisan, which just passed, on the second day of Pesach, right, the day after the first day of Chag. Pesach, again, there's a whole debate about what that date is, according to the Prushim and the Tzdukim, but we hold it's the day after the first day of Pesach. And the Shtei HaLechem. Now, the Korban HaOmer is brought from barley. The Shtei HaLechem is brought from wheat. And generally, we say it's brought from the new crop. And that was the whole discussion we had yesterday. The Mishnah said, number one, it's brought from the new crop, as opposed to other menachot, which could be brought from the old crop. And number two, it's brought from Israel only. But then we said, wait a minute. There's a Braita that has a different approach, which it actually could be brought from the old grain. And now but that Braita thought it has to be brought from Israel. Now we're going to bring a third Braita, or a third Tanaitic source, I should say, second Braita. Okay, so let's just review from the last line of yesterday's daf. The machloket only is about chadash, whether it has to be new or it can be also old. But the issue of Israel is definite. Everyone agrees with that. Kiman. Now that assumption, both in the Braita and in the Mishnah, is delo ki hai Tana. It's not like the following Tana. De Tanya Rabbi Yossi bar Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda Omer. Omer ba michutz la'aretz. Okay, he says the Omer can be brought from outside of Israel. Doesn't have to be brought from Israel. Umani makayem ki tavo al haaretz. Now the pasuk in Vayikra Kaf Gimel, when it discusses the holidays and what you're supposed to bring in there, it goes into a whole long description of the Korban HaOmer. It introduces it by saying when you get to the land. So wouldn't that assume that has to be from the land of Israel? No. Shaloni tchayvu ba'omer kodem shenichnesu la'aretz. All it's telling you is they weren't obligated in the Omer until they got to the land. This is when the obligation starts to tick in. The obligation begins when you get to the land of Israel. You don't have to bring the Omer until you're living in the land of Israel. But once you're living in the land of Israel, you have to bring it, and you can bring it from anywhere. Now, you have to add one other thing. Now, you would have to say that he holds that the whole prohibition of chadash is by Torah law also outside of Israel. So there was a debate whether it's by Torah law only in Israel. Okay, what is the issue of chadash? This means that the new crop is not permitted until the Korban HaOmer is brought. The Korban HaOmer basically permits everyone to eat the new grain. Until then, they're not allowed to eat from the new grains. They can only eat from the old grains. Now, where do we get that it's Doraita? Dichtiv moshvotechem. It shouldn't be mi moshvotechem. It's a different pasuk. I'll read you the pasuk now. It's again in that section, Vayikra Kaf Gimel and Parshat Emor. Velechem bekali v'karmel. We're going to come back to this karmel later. Lo tochlu ad etzem hayom hazeh. Don't eat lechem kali karmel. Okay, don't eat these things until the new crop, until the etzem hayom hazeh, until the essence by the middle of that day. Ad haviyachem et korban Elohechem, until you bring the korban. Chukat elam l'dorotechem b'chol moshvotechem. Now it says b'chol moshvotechem. That sounds like anywhere you're living. Okay, even though earlier we had explained moshvotechem is specifically Israel, here they're explaining that, again, these are different opinions. They explain moshvotechem here means wherever you're living. Kol makom shatem yoshvim mashma. Okay, wherever you are. The chi tavo, when it says ki tavo al haaretz in the beginning of that section, azman bi'ahu. That's just talking about when you get into the land. The first time, that's when you're going to be obligated. But kevan, now what's the connection of chadash being asur midoraita? Because they said kevan doraita, if chadash is forbidden doraita, even outside of Israel, that means that the new crop has status of being called new, and the old crop is old, and therefore kruvenami mikrivina, and therefore it can be used also as the raw materials for the sacrifice because it's within the realm of chadash. The assumption is if chadash wasn't forbidden in chutz la'aretz, then you wouldn't be allowed to bring it as the new crop because it wouldn't have the status of chadash that was significant enough to basically permit all the chadash out in Israel, right, if it was only in Israel. Okay, so now we have three opinions here, basically. One that says no chadash, no yashan, no old, and not outside of Israel. Then we had yes old, not outside of Israel. Then we had you could do it outside of Israel. It doesn't say what Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda would say about yashan, but definitely he thinks it can be brought from out of Israel. Okay, Tna Natam. Now we're going to bring a Mishnah in Shkalim. Shomrei, okay, you'll see in a minute the connection. Shomrei svichim b'shvi'i, notlim scharan mitrumat halishka. The people who would watch the things that grow on their own in Shnat Shemitah would get their reward, their salaries paid by the Trumat Halishka. Okay, why is this? Because they would be watching the fields. What are they watching the fields for? They're watching the fields to see what grows first, so they know. Now, again, you're not allowed to plant in the Shemitah year, but things that grow wild, you can use. So they were waiting. They basically would watch the fields to make sure that we know which is the first one that grew. Okay, and then we know that's what we're cutting from, because you're supposed to bring Reshit, the first of what grows, for the Korban HaOmer. So the people who'd be watching this, okay, they would get paid from the Trumat Halishka. So Rami Bar Chama le Rav Chisda. Okay, so Rami Bar Chama brings a contradiction on this to Rav Chisda. Okay, Tanan, he says, Shomrei Svichim b'Shvi, Notlim Scharam Mitrumat Halishka. He says, look, it says they get their money paid for from the temple treasury. Now, why do they get? Because we're going to use from the Svichim, from what grew wild, for the Korban HaOmer. Why is that? Because we have to use, right? Now, we have to use the new crop for the Korban HaOmer. And it grows in the Shemitah year, so we have, right, again, we can't plant it, but we can use it. By the way, what are they watching it from? So in the Rashi, in the Ketav Yad, he says, Shomrei Svichin shel Sorin letzorach HaOmer, right? It's the barley. They're watching the barley crop. Kedei shelo yitlum ha'aniyim. They don't want the poor people to access it, right? They don't want poor people to take it because they need what grew first. So now they say the following. Comes Rami Bar Chama and says to Rav Chisda, look, it says in the Mishnah, they get paid, meaning you use the Svichim. Urimenu, but wait, there's contradiction. When it comes to Shemitah, what are you allowed to do with Svichim? Le'ochla v'lo l'sreifa. You can gather things from the fields that grew on their own to eat them, but you can't gather them to burn them. Now the Korban HaOmer gets burned. So you can't use Shemitah stuff to burn it, for burning purposes. So Amar le Rav Chisda answers him, what are you talking about? We're going to now have a ping-pong conversation back and forth between the two of them. Rachmana amar lach ledorotechem va'at amarti batel. Well, what choice do we have? If we don't do it in the Shemitah year, because we can't get the new produce, but the Torah said, do it ledorotechem. That was what we read before. It's a chukat olam ledorotechem, right? B'chomash votechem. This is for all generations, this commandment, right? So, basically that you can't, right? Again, that was on the pasuk about not eating the new grain until you bring the Omer, but the point is you have to bring the Korban HaOmer. And that's something for all generations, which means even in the Shemitah year. So what choice do we have? So it's true, lo chlav lo l'sreifa, but sometimes you have to burn some of it because how else are you going to bring the Korban HaOmer? So comes Rami Bar Chama and says, Amalei. Right. So again, I'm going to read it. I think I read to the end, but Rachmana Amar Lach, Rav Chisda says L'Dorotechem, and Ad Amarti Batel, and you're saying it's going to be canceled once every 7 years. Amarle, Umi Kaminana Tibatel, Leti Mideshtikit. Rabbi Rachama said, don't accuse me of thinking that we're not going to do it at all. I just meant bring it from the previous year. Be'ina Carmel, Veleka. But he says, what do you mean? You need Carmel. Now, I said no, Carmel was in the pasuk before. Now, there was in a pasuk about all the things you can't eat until you bring the new crop. So Lechem, Kaliva, Carmel. But we're now going to read, Carmel comes up in a different pasuk. Okay, we're going to jump around all different places today in the Torah. We're now in Vayikra chapter 2. Okay, Vayikra chapter 2, there's this section, which the rabbis understand is talking about the Korban HaOmer. Okay, it's not 100% clear from the simple reading of it, but we're going to look at the pasuk. Okay, we're in Vayikra chapter 2, verse 14. Okay, it actually starts in verse 14. Im takriv mincha bikurim laHashem. If you bring a mincha bikurim, now what's a mincha bikurim? They say that's the mincha of the first grains, which they're going to say is the Korban HaOmer. Okay, we actually saw this before because in a few psukim it says migarsa umishamna. And if you remember, we said migarsa is barley. How do we get it? Because this is talking about barley, this section. So we've talked about this section before. Now, it says if you bring it, aviv kaloi ba'esh geres karmel takriv mincha bikurecha. Okay, so one of the things it says about it is it has to be, okay, aviv, which we'll see soon, we're going to use that word, but Carmel, they say is, okay, again, there's different interpretations, we saw this a little while ago about some interpretation, but Rashi says here that Carmel is Yeherach mal b'shat hakrava. Has to be soft. Okay, soft grains, what they really mean is young grains. Okay, we'll just call it simply young grains, however we define this. So he says, so now let's go back to the Gemara. Be'inan karmel v'leka. You can't take last year's crop, because if you take from last year and now you cut it, right, it's not going to be a young grain. It's going to be old from last year. So that's the problem. So again, he's going to say, you can't bring from last year. So if you have to bring from this year and you won't let us do the sfichin, we're going to have a problem because we won't, right? This goes back to, this is Rav Chisda, we won't be able to bring the Korban HaOmer this year. And obviously the Torah wants us to bring it every year and not just 6 out of 7 years. So now he says, V'leitemi karmel de eshteke. Why don't we take young grains from last year, but cut them last year, leave them until this year. So we'll cut them when they're young and not when they're, they've aged. We cut them early and then bring them this year. So he says, Amakra, karmel takriv, be'ina karmel b'sh'at hakrava v'leka. No, they have to be young at the moment because it says karmel takriv. The karmel goes right next to the word takriv. It means when you sacrifice it, it has to be karmel. It's not good enough to say, oh, we cut it when it was karmel and now we're going to use it this following year. Okay, so there comes Rav Chisda and basically says, don't say there's any contradiction here. Of course you need the people watching these gardens that are growing wild to be able to make sure that we're going to take the Omer from the right grains, from this year's stuff that grows this year, have the Shomrim make sure that poor people aren't taking them, and they watch them and they get paid from the temple treasury because we are going to use those. Okay, we are allowed, even though the ochlav lo l'sreifa, in this case there's an exception to the rule because otherwise we wouldn't be able to bring the Korban HaOmer in that year. Okay, this obviously holds it has to be from the new crop and not from the old crop. We saw there was a machloket there. Okay, itmar. Now we're going to have a machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar about the source for the fact that it has to come from the new grain. So Rabbi Yochanan amar karmel takriv, from where we just get it has to be karmel, so obviously it's from the new crop. Rabbi Elazar omer reshit kitzircha. Reshit kitzircha v'lo sof kitzircha. It has to be from the first thing that you cut, from the beginning and not from the end, right? So it has to be from the new crop. It can't be from the end of last year's crop. Okay, it has to be from the first thing you cut, and therefore it's obviously from this year. So we have two sources, one karmel takriv and one from reshit kitzircha. Okay, now, motiv Rabbah. Rabbah is now going to question Rabbi Yochanan. V'im takriv mincha bikurim, b'minchat ha'omer, akatu medaber. So now we're back to the pasuk that I mentioned in Vayikra Bet, where it didn't really say anything about the Omer, but it did talk about this minchat bikurim. And they say, and here's the drasha, as we said before, it's talking about minchat ha'omer, akatu medaber, okay, where the rabbis say, we know this pasuk is talking about the minchat ha'omer, even though it never mentions the word Omer. Mehechan hiba. Now, where does it come from? Now, it never said there barley either. Okay. Now, we did say migarsa means from the barley, but that's because they already had this drasha, and then they therefore said the garsa is the barley. Okay. But if you remember that early sugya, if not, you can ignore what I just said. But anyway, mehechan hiba minas seorim. Okay, it comes from barley. So now they say. How do you know it comes from barley and not from wheat? Maybe it comes from wheat. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Ne'amar aviv b'Mitzrayim, v'ne'amar aviv lidorot. Okay, it says aviv when it comes to Mitzrayim, and it says aviv lidorot, meaning this aviv. Ma aviv ha'amor b'Mitzrayim seorim, af aviv ha'amor lidorot, eno elaba mina seorim. Okay, now, where does it say Aviv b'Mitzrayim? Okay, we're thinking of, b'chodesh Aviv yatzanu b'Mitzrayim. But it actually says it in the Makat Barad. And it's describing the hail, what destruction it caused. And it says, Ki se'ora Aviv. So therefore they say, se'ora is Aviv. There we see the connection. So also here, when we talk about a commandment, that is, what they mean is, when it happened in Egypt, they called it Aviv. They called barley Aviv. So when it gives you the commandment about the Aviv here, okay, again, that was the pasuk. Im takriv mincha bikurim laHashem. That was the Vayikra Bet. Aviv kaloi be'esh geres karmel takriv et mincha bikurecha. So they say it has to be Aviv. From there, the word Aviv, they learn it's barley. And that's all learned out from Makat Barad, from the hail, the Makkah of hail, okay, the plague of hail. So now they say, Rabbi Akiva Omer, Matzinu Yachid. Okay, now we're going to have we're going to have three answers. Okay, I'm just reminding you where we were. We started with Machlokah, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar. Do we learn it from Carmel? That has to be the new, or do we learn it from Reshit? Okay, that can't be the Reshit Tzircha, it can't be the end of your Katsir. Now we're asking a difficulty on the Carmel Takrif. We're not that yet there. We have three explanations about how we know those Psukim in Vayikra and that the Korban Omer has to come from barley. Okay, so actually, I should just say, how do we know the Korban Omer has to come from barley? One is from the word Aviv that appears in Vayikra Bet, which, again, we had to first prove it was talking about the Omer, and then explain that Aviv connected with barley, and that was learned out from hail. Now we have Rabbi Akiva who's going to bring two other explanations, and it's the third one that's going to be relevant for our purposes. So Rabbi Akiva's first explanation is Rabbi Akiva Omer, Matzinu Yachid shemevi chovato menachitim, umevi chovato menaseorim. Okay, there's individual menachot that are brought from wheat, which is most of them, and there are individual menachot brought from barley, which is one of them, which is the minchat knaot of the sotah. The sotah has to bring a mincha, that's barley. Va'af tzibur, so now they say it must be comparable. Just like the yachid is barley, and that says explicitly in the Torah, and wheat, it must be for the community, right? Communal offerings, maybe chovato menachitim, or maybe chovato menaseorim. Okay, so it must be they also bring from the wheat and from the barley. Now, if you say that this minchat omer is brought from chitim, then there is no communal offering brought from barley because all the other ones are clear they're from wheat. So it's kind of process of elimination, right? There's no other one; it must be this one. Davar acher, third approach. Okay, this is the second of Rabbi Akiva. Omer ba menachitim ein shtei alechem bikurim. So they say, if you say the Omer comes from Chitim, then Shtei Alechem can't be Bikurim. It can't be the first one brought, because remember, the Shtei Alechem is the first one brought from the wheat, and the Omer is the first one brought from the barley. Now, if you bring the Omer from the wheat, then the Shtei Alechem can't be the first one, because you already brought from the wheat. So it must be, again, process of elimination, it must be from Bikurim. So now they say, this is a tiyuvta. Okay, why is it a tiyuvta? One second. Right. So they say, what do you get here? That they call, this is a little tricky, it's a little hard to understand why this is, it's not such a blatant contradiction, because we're trying to contradict that the source for the fact you have to bring it for the new crop is Carmel Takriv. Rabbi Elazar said it's from Reshik Tzircha, the first of your reapings. So that fits much better if you call the Shtei Alechem Bikurim, and it has to come from the first, and so does the Omer has to come from the first. That's the whole theory here behind Rabbi Akiva, that it has to come from your first, not Carmel. Carmel just means it has to be fresh. That doesn't mean it has to be the first. But here they're saying, shows it has to be the first, and therefore they're going to say that must be much more of a support for Rabbi Elazar. It doesn't seem to prove, it seems to go against Rabbi Akiva completely. Okay, Snanatan, next section. Now we're going to get to another halacha. Bikurim. Now we're talking about bikurim. Okay, we've been talking about all these other things relating to firsts and Shavuot also. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the bikurim, which are your first fruits. You only bring bikurim from the seven, what do you call them, species that Israel is praised for. Eretz Chita, Seorah, Gefen, Teina, Rimon, Shem, Dvash, all that. V'lo mitvarim shebaharim, v'lo miperot sheba'amakim. Turning out Amud Bet. We don't take from, not only from the seven fruits or grains fruits and grains that Israel is known for, but also from those like tamarim, which comes from the word dvash, or perot, whatever other perot produce you're going to bring, can't come from the mountains or from the valleys. What's the difference? What's the mountains and the valleys? Well, you could have stuff that's brought from, that grows there from the Shabbat Minim, but they're not the best. They don't grow well there. Okay? They're not the tastiest. So bring it from your best stuff, not the stuff that's growing in these places where it doesn't grow so well. So we don't bring bikurim from there. Amar Ula, im hivi lo kidesh. And Ula goes so far as to say, if you did, they're not sanctified. Bikurim have sanctity to them. When you bring your bikurim, they become sanctified. But they're not going to be sanctified. They're so not supposed to be brought that we're not going to have them. They're not going to be sanctified at all. Okay, that's the halacha. Yativ Rabba v'ka'amar la lahashmat. So Rabba comes and tells this halacha of ula, that if you bring produce, the bikurim, your first fruits, from places that it's growing that are not very good, then you did nothing, and they're not even sanctified. Well, after he says this, Eitive Rabbi Acha bar Abba l'Rabba. Okay, Rabbi Acha bar Abba clearly didn't agree with him, and he says, what are you talking about? I'm going to bring a braita. Now, there's a very long braita, and there's really one line that interests us, okay? But we're going to go through the long braita, and we're going to jump around to all sorts of psukim in the Torah, okay? So if you have a Tanakh or a Safari, and you can open the Tanakh, it might help you, but we're going to read through a bunch of psukim. Korban Reshit, okay? If not, don't worry, I will read you the psukim and give you a bit of the context. Okay, the first pasuk, Korban Reshit, this is Vayikra Bet Yud Bet, this is what we saw before, okay? Korban Reshit takrivu otam laHashem, ve'el mizbeach lo ya'alu l'reach nichoch. Okay, this is actually just before that section. Okay, we were in Vayikra Bet Yud Dalet, where it was talking about the Korban Omer. This is before. Okay, let's just read a bit of the pasuk before so you understand what context we're in. So it says, Kol mincha asher takrivu laHashem lo te'aseh chametz. Don't make your korbanot chametz. Then the next pasuk says, okay, and then it says, Kol or v'kol dvash lo taktiru. Remember, we've learned this before. You can't put anything leavened on the mizbeach other than korban reshit takrivu otam laHashem ve'el mizbeach lo yalu. Okay, just the korban reshit you can. What's the korban reshit? The shtei lechem, right? That and the lachmei todah, but we're going to leave that off for right now. But the korban reshit is one that you could bring that's chametz. Okay, now, what do they say here? Korban reshit t'shetehei reshit l'chol menachot. Okay, that has to be the first mincha you bring from the new crop. Okay, this is what we've learned before. V'cheinu omer, and there's another pasuk. Ba'akrivchem mincha chadasha laHashem b'shavuotechem. Okay, and it says, another place where it says this mincha chadasha, okay, there it called it reshit, which is the first, and here it calls it mincha chadasha. This is in Bamidbar, Kavchet, Kavav, where it talks about the sacrifices you're going to bring on the holidays, and it says, B'yom HaBikurim, that's Shavuot, akrivchem mincha chadasha laHashem. So there you see, it's going to be the first one, okay, b'shavuotechem. So now they say, Ein li ela chadasha shel chitim, chadasha shel seorim minayin. So that explains to us that when we bring this korban the shtei lechem, you can't bring any other korbanot. Now, both these things, korban reshit, it's the one that you bring that's first, and it's the mincha chadasha. What do we learn? We learn that it has to come from the new crop, and we learn that you can't bring any other korbanot before it that come from the new crop. However, this is all from wheat. So how do you know that I can't bring, for example, a barley sacrifice before? And even logic would say maybe I can, because we already brought the first barley from the new grain on the Mincha Omer. So maybe once you do the Mincha Omer, it permits the new barley grain, okay, which it doesn't. I'll just remind you. The Omer permits new grains to be eaten in general, okay, by everyone, the new grains of barley and of wheat, outside the temple. The shtei lechem permits it inside the temple, all the new stuff. But the question is, where do you get it from? Because it really is, the shtei lechem is only wheat. So how do you know that until this is brought, you can't bring a barley sacrifice? So chadasha shel seorim minayin. How do we know it's the first of seorim? Talmud lamar chadasha chadasha. Well, there's another pasuk that discusses the shtei lechem, and it calls it chadasha. It called it mincha chadasha in Bamidbar when it talks about all the sacrifices, and it called it chadasha also in Vayikra, Kaf Gimel in Parshat Emor, what we were reading before, when it talks about the sacrifices you bring on the holidays, right? There's two sections that discuss unique laws about the holidays. In Bamidbar, it's all the sacrifices that are the Musaf offerings. And in Vayikra Kaf Gimel, it's all the sacrifices that are specifically unique. Again, there's questions about where's the overlap and all that, but there's ones that are unique to that day that are in addition to the Musafim ones. So anyway, in both places, the shtei lechem is mentioned, and in both places, it calls it chadasha. So because it says chadashah twice, we do what we call an imeno inyan, where we don't need it twice. So imeno inyan, the chadashah shel chitim, if you don't need it to teach, this is the first, and only after that can you bring all the grain, any minchas you want from grain, the new grain. Tunei inyan, the chadashah shel seorim. So we're going to say the second one is coming to say, it's also the first that you can't bring any barley menachot beforehand from the new grain. Okay, so the first part of this braita, again, remind you when we get back to it why we're bringing this, because we have a contradiction to what Ula said, that if you bring from the bad produce your bikurim, okay, you can see we're not even up to bikurim yet, then lo kidesh, it's not sanctified at all. But we're not there yet. So the first part of this Braita, section 1, was all about how do you know that the shtei alechem, that until you bring the shtei alechem, you can't bring any sacrifice in the temple, not from wheat and not from barley, from the new grain. So the first part was, how do you know it comes before all other menachot, right, from the new crop? Now we're going to say, how do you know that you're supposed to first bring the shtei alechem and then the bikurim, right? They're both obligations of Shavuot, but before you bring any bikurim, you have to bring the shtei alechem. Talmud lomar, v'chag Shavuot te'aser lecha bikurei ktsir chitim. It says, okay, this is a bit of a difficult drasha. There's many interpretations of how they get it from this pasuk. But let's just go with the simple, which is Chag HaShavuot Ta'aseh Lecha, make for yourself. What did we make for yourself? We'll bring the korban, which is the shtei alechem. And then it says Bikurei Ktsir Chitim, and then bring the bikurim of your wheat. Okay, so from there you see bikurim come after the shtei alechem. Okay, but wait, what kind of bikurim were they discussing there? Just wheat. How do you know? Barley also, right? That when you bring bikurim of barley, they're going to come after wheat. That's the next question. So how do you know it's not just the first grains? Maybe you could bring the first barleys before you do the shtei alechem. Talmud lomar v'chag hakatzir bikurei ma'asecha asher tizra basadeh. Okay, now we're jumping to a completely different pasuk. Okay, this pasuk is in Shmot Kaf Gimel pasuk Tet Zayin. Okay, and it's talking about Chag HaKatzir, which is Shavuot, and it says bikurei ma'asecha asher tizra basadeh. So now in this pasuk is mentioned bikurei ma'asecha, and then it says asher tizra basadeh. So now they're saying the bikurim relate to also things that grow in the field. Okay, so now they say, and it also says Chag HaKatzir first, meaning, or maybe you could even say bikurei ma'asecha, it's talking about the ma'asim, what you're supposed to do on Shavuot. Somehow there it also references shtei alechem first, and then asher tizra basadeh, which sounds like anything you plant, which would obviously include barley. But now they still have more questions. Still things are missing. Ein li ela shetizra, alume elehem minayin. How do you know that if they just grew on their own? What if I didn't plant them? And it just grew. How do I know I still have to bring those first crops also? And again, bring them after the shtei alechem. Talmud lamar basadeh. It says asher tizra basadeh. Basadeh includes, right, you could have just said asher tizra. We know obviously you do it in the fields. In the fields includes anything that grows in your fields. Ve'ein li ela basadeh. You ready? Here comes the line we're looking for. That would only include things in the field. Minayin lerabot shebagag v'shebachurva v'shebatzitz v'shebasfina. How do I know things that grow in the roof, in a ruin, in a plant, or on a boat? Talmud lomar bikurei kol asher ba'artzam. Okay, now we go to a completely different pasuk. In Bamidbar Yud Chet pasuk Yud Gimel it says bikurei kol asher ba'artzam asher yaviu laHashem l'chayiyeh. This is to the kohanim. You will be given all the bikurim that are in their land. Kol asher ba'artzam. Kol asher ba'artzam seems to include bikurim come also from anywhere. Okay, now what is this? What do you see here? Here's the problem. From here it seems like even things that grow, right, in places where it's not going to grow very well. On your roof, in your ruin, in a plant, on a boat. Okay, obviously they're not going to grow as well in those places. And yet it sounds like you're chayav. Okay? So that's the problem, but we're going to continue because now we're up to part 3 of the Braita. Minayin shetei kodemet l'nisachim u'peirot ha'ilan. How do we know that when you have libations to bring, or peirot, like things that come from trees, bikurim on trees, you still bring the shtei alechem before that? Ne'emar kam bikurei ma'asecha, v'ne'emar lahalan ba'asbachat ma'asecha min hasadeh. Okay, this is all from one pasuk. This is a pasuk that compares Chag HaKatzir to Chag HaAsif. We're in Shmot Kaf Gimel pasuk Tet Zayin. Chag HaKatzir bikurei ma'asecha asher tizra basadeh. That's what we saw before. Okay, that's Chag HaKatzir. Then it says Chag HaAsif b'tzeit hashana ba'asbachat ma'asecha min hasadeh. So what does it say ma'asecha when you gather the stuff from your fields? What does it mean ma'asecha? Ma lahalan nisachim u'peirot ha'ilan. That includes libations which are made from wine, okay, grapes. So that includes the grapes, right? The harvest that they're talking about there is the harvest of the grapes and the harvest of the fruits. So afkan nisachim perot hailan. So likewise, the beginning of that pasuk, they're juxtaposed together, must be referring also to that, and it mentions bikurei maasecha. Bikurei, right? What does it say? Bikurei maasecha. That's where you see the bikurim come from these as well. And once bikurim come from these, we're going to assume the shtei alechem comes first, right? Again, if you look at that pasuk, chag katsir first, and then bikurei maasecha. Okay, now. But now we're done with this braita, and now we're saying, why did we bring this in the first place? Because it says there, shebagag, shebechurva, shebatzitz, v'shebasfina. So what do you see here? You bring bikurim from there. Now remember, there were 3 sections. I just want to remind you. The first section was, how do you know that you can't bring any korban, mincha, from the new crop until after, right, whether it's barley or wheat, until after you bring the shtei alechem. The second section was, how do we know we bring bikurim only after you brought the shtei alechem? That's where our section was, right? This the part that was relevant to us was. And how do you know that you bring nisachim, the libations and the perot ha'ilan, also only after you did the shtei alechem? So now they say, Seifa atan the Menachot. That line in the second section, which was talking about bikurim, and we thought it was, and it was saying these are bikurim, right? Even things, kol asher ba'artzam comes to include even things that grow in these places. No, it wasn't really. Okay? It was actually referring back to section 1. And that line was actually saying, how do we know that when you bring a mincha from places, right? That's actually saying, let me just clarify for 1 second. The Menachot, right? The shtei alechem, how do you know that you have to bring the shtei alechem before you bring a mincha that comes from the gag, bechurva, and all that? Okay? And it's not really, now this is a bit of a difficult interpretation because it really was in the second section, but they're claiming that line goes back to the previous section about the Menachot. So now they're going to say the following. So let's say you could sort of reread the Braita that way, which already is somewhat difficult, to say that all of a sudden we're going back to section 1, even when it's pretty clearly sectioned off 3 questions. But you could say, we mean, how do you know, not just remember, how do you know you have to bring any sacrifices you bring after the shtei alechem, until you bring the shtei alechem, it has to be, right, the barley and the wheat can't be used for sacrifices. Also things that grow in the roof and all that, right, and if it's new, you can't bring that till after the shtei alechem. That's what that line is coming from. But remember where they darshaned it from. They darshaned it from this pasuk, Bamidbar Yud Gimel, which says, Bikurei kol asher ba'artzam asher yaviu laHashem l'chayiyeh. The bikurim of all these things are going to you, which we assume was bikurim. Now we're going to say it's mincha. Kol tahor bebeitcha yochlenu. Anyone in your household can eat it. Now that's going to be a bit of a problem. Why? Because if we say, Matkef la Ravad Barava, Ihachi, if so, Hainu dichtiv, where it says, Kol tahor bebeitcha yochaloto, Menachot are only eaten by the male kohanim. So if you say this pasuk is talking about menachot, which we just said, right? So already it was a little hard to read the Braita that way. Now it's hard to read the pasuk that way. The pasuk is obviously talking about bikurim and not about menachot, because menachot are only by male kohanim and not anyone who's tahor in your house, which includes women, which includes your Canaanite slaves. So Amarav Masharshia Trey Krai Ktive. And there's actually 2 things going on in this pasuk. K'tiv l'chayiyeh. The first part says l'chayiyeh. That's talking about the menachot. Uk'tiv kol tahor beveitcha yochaloto. And that's talking about bikurim. Haketzad kam bikurim kam menachot. So answer number 1 is the pasuk talking about both. And don't worry about the last part, because the last part's actually talking about bikurim. Rav Ashi Amar kule b'menachot. Second answer. It's really all talking about menachot. Sefer Dukran ata lelachmei todah. But the end of that pasuk is talking about the 4 lachmei todah. If you remember, 4 out of the 40 go to the Kohen, and those can be eaten. So it's all talking about menachot. Most menachot can only be by male Kohanim, but there is one mincha that could be eaten, that the part that goes to the Kohen can be eaten by also the women and also the slaves, and that's the lachmei todah, the 1 out of 10 loaves, right? The 4 out of 40 that are given to the Kohen. Okay, so we resolved that. So this was all. I just want to remind you, we started with Mishnah. It says you can only bring bikurim from the Shevat Aminim, but not from the Shevat Aminim that grow in these places where it doesn't grow very well. We said, what about this source, which seems to say you do bring, and if you do, right, the main point was, Ula said if you do, they're not sanctified, but yet it seems like they are sanctified from our Braita. But then we said the Braita, when it talks about those bikurim, are only talking about menachot and not bikurim. And then we had to reread the Braita, and then reread the pasuk, which seemed like it was really talking about bikurim. Now we said the pasuk is either talking about both bikurim and menachot, or maybe only about menachot. And we explained it in both ways. Okay, now we get to a machloket about this topic. Rabbi Yochanan Amar Imevi lo kidesh, just like Ula said, it's not going to be sanctified. Rish Lakish Amar Imevi kidesh, if you brought it, is sanctified. It's like some sort of weak kodshim, like a bad korban. You bring a lean animal, it's not the best, but it's gonna be sanctified. Okay, Rish Lakish explained his logic. Ela Rabbi Yochanan my time, but what about Rabbi Yochanan? He didn't explain his reason. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan chazai b'chalom. Rabbi Elazar says, look, Rabbi Yochanan appeared to me in a dream, so I know miltam al yatamina. I know I'm saying the right thing. A little bit strange. Amar kra mi reshit velo kol reshit me artzecha velo kol artzecha. Okay, these are the psukim by the bikurim. This is velakachta mi reshit kol priim by Midbar Kafav, verse 2. Me reshit kol pri asher tavi me artzecha. Me is always not all of them. Okay. Mi reshit velo kol reshit, me artzecha velo kol artzecha. So there's sometimes you bring where it's not going to be good, like from your bad crop. For Rish Lakish, hi artzecha my avadle. So what does he do with it? Mimbai lelechedetanya. Rabbi Gamliel barebi omer ne'amar kan eretz v'ne'amar lalan eretz malalan shevach eretz ach kan shevach eretz. He uses it to teach us it's only things that Israel is known to have the best fruits, meaning the 7 species. So where? Because it comes from this pasuk, Eretz Chita, Seorah, Gefen, that famous pasuk about those 7 fruits. So now they're going to say that's what the Eretz is coming for, not to teach you only some things from the Eretz, because he thinks even those will be bikurim from the bad stuff. V'idach, so what does Rabbi Yochanan say then? How does he learn the Shivat HaMinim? Eretz me Eretz. He darshans also the word Eretz and also the word me Eretz, and obviously Rish Lakish, Idach Eretz me Eretz lo mashvali. He doesn't have that. Okay, Tanichada. We're now going to have one last thing here. One Braita says Shebagag v'Shebachurva v'Shebatzit v'Sfina mevi v'Korei v'Tani Idach mevi ve'ino Korei. So now we're going to say one says you bring and you actually say the declaration with it. That's what you're supposed to do when you bring bikurim. And one says you bring and you don't korei. Okay, the whole mikra bikurim we just read at Leila Seder. That's what we do, right? The Arami Oved Avi is what you say with one extra section about bringing into the lamb, which we don't say on Seder night. So Bishlama Rish Lakish Gagagag Lokashya. Now, how do you explain the contradiction between these two sources? One is talking about a gag of a cave, which is on ground level. And one is gagabayit, which is not ground level, and that you wouldn't read. Okay, but the one that grows on the ma'ara actually grows well. Chorva lokashya, kam b'chorva avuda, kam b'chorva she'en avuda. One was cultivated, one was not cultivated. Cultivated can grow well, not cultivated well. Atzitz lokashya, kam b'nakuv, kam b'she'en nakuv. Also the plant. Well, if it has a hole, then it's more attached to the ground, it'll grow better. If it doesn't have a hole, then it doesn't grow as well. Sfina lokashya, kam sfina shel eitz, kam sfina shel cheretz. There's a big debate about what the difference is in which direction it goes, and what exactly an earthenware sfina is. But again, however we explain it, one grows well, one doesn't, and that resolves according to Rish Lakish. But we're going to say, Rabbi Yochanan kasha, but Rabbi Yochanan doesn't make any sense because he doesn't think it's even sanctified. So he wouldn't have to bring it at all. So how do we explain this? We'll leave that for next class. Okay, so what we dealt with is first, we had this opinion that the Omer can come from outside of Israel, and we saw the Psukim. Then we talked about this contradiction with the Shomrei Svichim. How can we bring stuff from the Shemitah year and the discussion, the back and forth between Lachi Lava L'Sleifa, Rav Chisda resolved it, because otherwise we would have none. Then we saw Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar, where we get the fact that it has to come from the new crop. And then we talked about the Bikurim coming from, right, you don't bring it from the bad ones, and that basically led us to this whole long Braita, where we saw that basically it looks like you do bring Bikurim, then we said, no, that's talking about Menachot. And then we get to the fact that this is really a machloket. If you did bring, is it sanctified, is it not sanctified? And then we just brought this source that seems to work much better with Rish Lakish. These two sources that the only way to resolve and explain them would be to say, no matter what, they're sanctified. It's just a matter of do you read the text or do you not read the text? And that works well according to Rish Lakish. Doesn't really seem to work according to Rabbi Yochanan. We'll get back to that in the next class. Wishing everyone a good day and Moadim L'Simcha.